You're listening to Improvisations. I'm Todd Steed, and it's my distinct honor to be speaking with Jeremy Pelt, who has a double release out, a book and a new recording, both of which are really deep, rich experiences. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Well, thanks for having me, Todd. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Did you ever at any point in this project think like, man, this could take years, this book, you know?
It didn't occur to me, not particularly. I mean, when I finally decided that I was going to set out and do it, time wasn't really an issue, not an issue, but more, it wasn't a consideration, especially considering that I was doing it pre-COVID times. So, I mean, a lot of it had to do with my own personal schedule, of which was very busy. So everybody was busy. So it was just one of those things where I'll interview you when I can get the time to. So, I mean, I didn't have a conception of, oh, this is going to take, however long.
And it expanded while you were doing it, right? Like you started incorporating maybe some people that initially you didn't think about.
Yeah, that's correct. So, I mean, when I first started the project, I was really keen on including the elder Black musicians that I felt like weren't getting the ink, as much ink as the ones that we do celebrate, that should be celebrated anyhow. So, like the Ron Carters and the Benny Golsons and those, and Roy Haynes and all those people that are celebrated, and they paid their dues, of course, so they deserve to be. But there's a whole, I felt like, legion of others that were still out here making music and weren't quite talked about as much. So that was my aim at first, and then I think the thing that broke that, or not broke it, but the thing that kind of made me reconsider other generations, was I was actually on the road with Kenny Barron, and we were someplace for 2 days in a row. We were in Boston for 2 days in a row, and I said to myself, I said, I would kick myself if I have Kenny Barron here and I didn't interview him. So I did, and that was like the first of the generation of elder musicians that had a high profile that I interviewed. I mean, the first interview that I actually did was Warren Smith, and then there was Paul West and Bertha Hope. But Kenny Barron is somebody that's I feel like a higher profile. So I got him, and then after a while, not too long after that, then I decided, well, you know what, let me get some other generations too. And I went, actually Jonathan Blake, a good friend of mine who's in my generation, a drummer, he was on the gig too. And I said, you know what, I'm gonna interview you too. So I have some of my generation, and it just kind of snowballed like that.
Ideally, I think this book could appeal to anybody that's interested in what's going on in the world right now. But for you, ideally, who is the group you want to make sure reads this or gets to know this content?
Without a doubt, the young contingent of musicians in particular that are coming up right now, especially in the Black community. I mean, it doesn't necessarily, and I don't ever want to make it seem like it's limited to just the Black community of young upstarts, but certainly with the genre that we're talking about, especially, I think it's of importance if you're keen to be a practitioner of this music. And one of the other reasons that I decided to go ahead and pursue it was because, particularly, I felt like there was a disconnect between the generations, where for several different reasons it could be, but whatever reason, it still led to the fact that there's a disconnect. And sometimes younger cats don't really have the wherewithal or the means, or are shy about reaching out to people that are older and more established, and so I wanted to create something to where it's a personable type of read, that you see there are these specific questions that are answered, and at a certain point in your life, you'll realize that you kind of your situations might very well run parallel to that which you've read. You know, I there's ever since this book has come out, my main inspiration, and I'm not shy about mentioning it, has been Art Taylor's Notes and Tones. And one of the things about that book, and about really any piece of literature, I feel, and as well in music, and I mean, you could limit it to all types of arts, let's face it. But the thing about it is that art, notes and tones, for instance, means something completely different to me now than it did when I was 17 and reading it. You know, there were things that I couldn't grasp. So I want something that you can come back to and say, oh, you know, and that was important to me.
Yeah, and I gotta say, for me, it's really a rich read, because you don't know what people are going to say, you know. And a lot of these people I've read interviews or watched interviews with for years, and have never heard a lot of these anecdotes or a lot of these thoughts. And it reminded me of my own growing. I'm from Tennessee, you know. I grew up in Tennessee, and it reminds me when I was growing up and going to high school, and it was a mostly white high school. We had a few black students, and you know, I had classes with them, and was friends with them. But I noticed, like, sometimes when they would get together and I would just sort of be walking by, I noticed a completely different language being spoken, and it made me very curious about
Mm.
a lot of things. You know, like, wow, why? Uh, Maybe I'm doing something that makes them feel limited on how they communicate. You know, which I think is the case, and you know, starting to have these conversations. But I think one of the reasons for me this book is so strong, it kind of feels like I'm getting to hear black folks discuss what's important to them without the lens of, like, you know, a jazz mag. Nothing against jazz magazines and things like that,
Right.
but it feels different in that way. And for example, Ken Burns could never get Wynton Marsalis to cuss that much, you know.
Right. You know, that, you know, I tell you, you know, it's like you said, there are certain things, and I've known, you know, especially with this volume, I've known everybody in there for years. And so sometimes when you know somebody for a long time, especially on a personal level, not just even reading, but you know somebody, you think that you know where their answers are gonna go, you know, go. So you ask these questions in the back of your mind, you're like, I think I know what it's gonna say. And then when it's something different, you're like, oh wow, you know. And so I think that the element of surprise is always something that I look forward to when I'm doing these. It's just like I hadn't considered that you thought that at all. You know, and to your point also about Winton, yeah. It's funny you mentioned that, but that's you know that's the magic of that kind of interplay between musician to musician, I think, and that's why it's a potent and an important kind of documentation to have. Much in the same way, I mean, look, I mean, all of those cats that Art Taylor mentioned were characters. Interviewed were characters, from Miles to Dexter to Sonny. Everybody had a very their own kind of personalities, and you know, you really got a chance, for instance, with Miles, to see how playful he was. I mean, he didn't really get serious until maybe like the middle of the interview. You know what I mean? Even you could tell in Art Taylor's tone, he's like, "Come on, man, are you gonna answer these questions or not?" You know. So you know, you kind of get a different kind of picture of how we deal with each other when we're, and that all points to being comfortable.
Well, and I think, you know, you talked about the next generation and students. The first thing I thought about when I was reading this book, and by the way, it's called Griot, and it comes with an accompanying CD, Jeremy Pelt, Griot, This Is Important. The first thing I thought about was, you know, we have a jazz program at the University of Tennessee. Eric Reed just joined us. We got Gregory Tardy down here, a bunch of great folks. But the first thing I thought of was, they need to get this to every single student in that program,
I agree.
because I just think that there's so many things people could benefit from hearing.
Yeah. No, I mean, and there's all types of components and reasons for why this is out there right now. I mean, that I would like, that I put it out there. And uh, again, the first and foremost thing for me is trying to bridge that gap, in terms of the younger generation responding and knowing the older generation and what their thoughts and how things were before they got there, which kind of might have enabled the things that they do at this point. So that's a very important thing, and that's nothing to sneeze at, but it's also a very important educational component.
And you're a teacher as well. And have you given this to any students yet, or gotten any feedback from young people?
I do teach at William Patterson University, and a few of my students have bought the book, and I'm waiting to hear any feedback. I know the director of the program has a book. I'm going to give one of the books to the library. I've also donated a book to my alma mater, and I'm also donating a book to Temple University. So I mean, it's I'm trying to get in where I can get in.
You talked about the surprises in the interviews, and man, there's so many in here that I loved. I mean, I loved them all, but some Greg Hutchinson, that one ended up being one of my favorites because I just didn't know much about him. I know that name,
Mhm.
Yeah, he's great. But that one was one of the ones that really jumped out at me. But I think the one that really moved me the most was Renee Marie's
Yeah.
interview. And
Mhm.
there's a moment where in the interview where she's talking about she had this moment of being overseas, and the interviewer, and I believe it was Russia or somewhere, referred to her as an American, and she sort of was taken aback.
Right.
Um, that's a powerful thing to consider. And I wonder if has that happened to you, being overseas, where all of a sudden then you become the American,
I think in recent memory, the one time where I was kind of struck with that fact, over the head, was when Trump first got elected, because I left to go to Europe, I think the day at like November 5th or whatever day that was that he got elected in 2016. I left that next day, and so I remember sitting in Spain and having a conversation with somebody, and it just, that was the thing that uh I didn't, a lot of us didn't want to happen. And so when it did, and then you go overseas and encountering people over there, and it was, there was, when I say encounter, it wasn't any kind of rash reaction, but it was just something, now where everybody's questioning you, like, wow, so how does that feel? And it's it's like, wow, you had to really think about it and formulate your answer, because you're still in, I still was in a sort of denial over that. So that was something that immediately struck me, when that in terms of being overseas and dealing with it, you know.
Did you find that you evolved as an interviewer as it went on? Because that's an art and a skill in and of itself.
And I'm glad you asked that. I do feel like that. I mean, I think one of the even though it's not in order, the chapters in terms of who I interviewed first. Like I said, the first interview I did was Warren Smith, and I wrote down a whole bunch of questions, and then the second person was Paul West, and from that I started to really be able to kind of streamline a lot of the questions and make them more concise and clear. So I did find myself able to slowly evolve into the whole process, so that and it's still evolving. It's still evolving, because then a lot of it has to do with the generations of people that I'm interviewing, right? So I'm not going to necessarily have the same questions for somebody that's 20 some odd years old that I would ask for somebody that's 84, because they haven't seen that much life. But then other questions I ask the same thing on purpose, just so that you could see the difference between how somebody that's 20-year-old is thinking about things and how somebody that's lived it and the 80-year-old is thinking about it. So I mean, it's almost like a science project.
Well, and one of those things that a reoccurring question, and that's one of the things I really loved about the book, is that you stuck with it, and you asked a lot of the same things. So one could really see how many different ways there are to interpret something. Like,
Sure.
what do you think about the word jazz? There
Yeah.
are so many different answers to that question in this book.
Yeah, yeah.
What do
It, you know,
what do you think about all that? All the different answers.
well, it was, I think one of the other things about interviewing that I've seen from some of the best in the business that have done it is that, it's always a setup at a certain point, and that is an example of a typical example of me setting up the person to get a response to see what they're saying. Because, especially with regard to um, that question is something that comes up once every 20 or so odd years, right? So it certainly is not anything that's new to my generation. It's not new to the last generation before me. I mean, that's something that's been considered all the way back to the 30s. And every musician has had a point of view about it, dating back then. And then, sometimes it goes dormant, and then it has another reemergence. Like, are we still dealing with it? So, and it's maybe about 10 years ago or so, there was a big kind of resurgence of what we all thought about it. And so that brought forth a lot of feelings from a lot of people. And so I thought it was, important to document that.
Well, one thing that never came out clearly to me is what you think of that word describing this incredible music.
My thing is this, and I actually got to go back to my notes. I had to paraphrase myself, paraphrasing Justin Robinson. But one of the things that stuck out to me, like it hit me like a ton of bricks when I was interviewing him, and I asked him that same question, as he says, words like symbols evolve, and that is something that hit me to the core, because I actually believe that to a great extent. So I'm not bothered by the word jazz. You know, I understand the ramifications of it. I really do. But in when you think about the fact that now it's over 100 years old, and where it came from, the original meaning of it, um, I, it's not something to necessarily be proud of in that respect, but it morphed even in that period of time. And then certainly now, being in 2021, I want to find one person that would refer to jazz as being some kind of miscreant or devious sexual activity. I don't know anybody that thinks on those terms, you know. So therefore, I'm like, it it's morphed and it's changed into something that's a respectable term. Now I think it's going too much in the other direction though. Now, right now, it's my 9-year-old daughter talking about she hates jazz because what she thinks of it is something that you had to think about. You had to sit down for. So now you have to. It's earned its respectability, but it's also it doesn't. It comes with this amount of apprehension. Certainly, from people that think that it's only one way.
Did somebody, in the course of these interviews say something that you just really strongly disagreed with? Or you're like, oh, I just don't buy that, or anything like that?
No, not once, not once.
And that's
And I've
really
got
amazing
over
because,
50 interviews.
yeah, there's so many interviews, but there's something about the flow of them that I just really love. It feels like I mentioned earlier, I've read a lot of interviews of these folks, but there's there's moments in here like I've never really seen this person through this lens or talking this deeply about this subject or that subject. Could you feel that as the interviews were happening?
I didn't think on those terms, but it's certainly refreshing when I hear people tell me that, because again, it's a conversation that was taped for the purpose of putting out a book, but it's also, um, kind of that example of that I was talking about before, where there are certain things that I know about people that don't shock me, as and then the other questions, that like when you talk to Nash or when you talk to Winton about their views on just wanting to just be they're humanists, which I'm like, oh, okay. Not to say that, I mean, I'd be shocked to hear that they are, because of course you are, but in response to a question that was more, I guess, Afrocentric and um it's the way that it was asked, to hear that, it's like, okay, so I mean, you want to steer it towards that, and that's what you think, and that's a beautiful thing. But there was nothing that was really shocking to me, or that had any kind of pause.
Are you surprised that the this comes up in the book a couple times, in the jazz programs, the lack of black students pursuing these jazz degrees, or is this something that you see getting less students doing it or more, or why aren't there more?
uh I mean, that's a bigger issue. I mean, I think that a lot of these programs are very expensive. There's not enough outreach to the communities, so I mean, and so if you have a community of in a, let's say, a 10 block radius, and there's 15 kids that are exceptionally black kids that are exceptionally talented, and they all want to go to this school, the school still wants to make their money, what I'm saying? But they'll go ahead and say, okay, here's one scholarship per 15 kids, So I mean, and I mean, that's a broad term, but I do think that there's a lot of work to be done in terms of making it affordable for them to pursue the degree, to begin with. So that's something. There are a number of black students that are pursuing the degree, but it's also, it could be the instruction too. I mean, there's many different ways to look at it.
And one of the things that make this so remarkable is that it comes with a soundtrack. You don't get that with every book, and the record is just, it's some of my favorite music that you've done, and it's interspersed. And for those that haven't heard it yet or hearing it for the first time tonight, it's interspersed with some of the spoken parts, which makes it really interesting if you've already read the book, because then you can hear the actual voice. Did
Yeah.
you compose this music before some of the interviews or after? Were you inspired directly by some of the interviews? How'd that come about?
It was all after, because I needed the sound bites to compose to, so it was definitely all after.
And did you, play the cuts back to the people that inspired the cut and say, what do you think?
I did. Well, I couldn't play it obviously to Larry Willis and Harold Mayburn. I think they'd approve though, but everybody else they were just completely flattered and knocked out that they even had a song written for them. Yeah.
Well, I bet Harold Mayburn would have loved it. To me, he was, when I saw his name in there, I got a little choked up, honestly, because he's from Memphis, actually, Memphis, Tennessee. But he's one of those people that I've always felt have been there 100% and were just brilliant, and maybe never got a lot of attention, or maybe the amount of attention that you thought they deserved. And of course, his voice is incredible.
Very present. Yeah.
Yeah,
His interview will come out in the second volume.
yeah. When is the second volume coming out?
Next February.
Okay.
Yeah.
Xin Lu is on this record, and this is one of the things that, on the vibraphone, that is really fascinating about me. I mean, this is a project definitely about the realities of your take on this incredible history of Black music in the United States. And then you have a Taiwanese vibraphonist. I'm wondering what she makes of all this, and like, is this like instant enlightenment for her, or some sort of a unique window?
That's a good question. I think that's a question you should ask her. I never really, well, I'll tell you the truth, is that none of the musicians on this record knew what I was actually up to. I told them I told them exactly, I said, listen, we're gonna record it like this. We, dynamically, I need this to happen because and I told them, I said, I'm gonna put some words to this. So I gave them these instructions, but they didn't really understand until they heard it. You know what I mean? So in that sense, it's like filming a movie on CGI or green screen, right? It's like, that this big monster is chasing you, but you don't see it because you're just there with a green screen. And so you just have to trust that the director says, all right, duck, and you duck when the director says duck, and you jump when the director says jump. And then when you get to the premiere, then you see the whole thing, and it's Jurassic Park. So it's kind of like that. And we haven't really, I think it's starting to dawn on her now. She texted me, she's like, wow, this is, a big deal, so.
Yeah, and I got a feeling this book and this music's going to be around for a long time. I'm actually, after I finished reading it, I was like, oh, I'm buying at least a couple more copies, because there's I would love to have it just in our radio station for any of our new hosts or our 30-year hosts. I was like, this is, while you're sitting there producing this show, there's some great things to consider in this book. And I just want to thank you for writing it, because I know it was a lot of work.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you.
All right. Well, Jeremy Pelt, thank you so much for your time, and we'll be looking forward to Volume 2, but really enjoying Volume 1 and the book Griot, which is, I think it's going to be in its own way a standard.
Well, thanks so much. And if anybody wants to get it, they can go to my website and find it on there, jeremypelt.net, and the link will be there for this shop.
And I would also just add, people need to go and get on the Jeremy Pelt Instagram feed, because it will make you hungry in a number of ways. But it's a great feed, and the beginning of the pandemic, I've watched your feed a lot. You were playing. It was almost like medicine. That was a great thing.
Well, thanks so much. Thank you.
All right. Well, take care, and good luck out there.
All right. Thank you. All right.